at this point.
Okay.
Just a brief introduction. Our good friend and professional engineer, Gord Cook, is back to talk about HRVs and basically the issue of maintenance. Gord is from Construction Instruction Incorporated. Certainly, Gord, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Claude, and thanks for having me on. And thanks for mentioning Construction Instruction. That's actually a company that I work with in the United States that has a really interesting training center. If anybody's interested in it, it's a hands-on experience, a 2-day hands-on experience to a working lab where we can actually try some things and so on. As well in Canada, we work under the company named Building Knowledge Canada. We do a lot of work in new housing, helping builders and communities make better decisions with respect to energy efficiency. And Claude, this topic goes way back, as you and I were just chatting, to the early 80s, right? HRVs, my first introduction to this industry was designing and building these boxes, heat recovery ventilation systems. At that time, we called them air-to-air heat exchangers or just simply air exchangers. And they primarily went into what we would call new, tightly sealed homes. What we started to realize is we actually needed them in all houses, and we'll chat about that just a little bit as we go through. And as you mentioned, the specifics of today, just a short little session, specifically on the inspection and maintenance, just to make sure they're working well. Some of the things that the occupants of a home need to look at, and sometimes it's items that maybe the community members need to look at, maybe maintenance staff. So we'll try to highlight both of those elements as we go through the day. And what I would suggest we talk about, I've got the wrong slide up. My apologies. You know what? We're gonna have to start again. I've screwed up. I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
I don't know what happened. Oh, I see what's happened. God. I'm so sorry. Just give me a second. I'll check to make sure I've got everything. I made one change at the end. You don't mind restarting, do you?
Not a problem.
God, I'm just a little confused.
Okay. We're on again.
Great. And thank you. Sorry, did you want to do the introduction?
Actually, I just sort of paused it, so
Ah.
we could take it from there, and I'll try and nip that session out.
Fair enough. So I'll go to here. And so today in this brief session, let's just talk about the following items. We'll go back and look at the quick fundamentals of HRVs, heat recovery ventilators, and the value they bring. We'll do a review of some of the key HRV installation elements, just so we can recognize the different types of installations you may see out in homes in your community. And really today is mostly about the essential HRV maintenance items, service and maintenance items that you want to think about. And I'll mention, of course, some of the tools and products you're going to need in order to do maintenance and service of HRVs. And so what we want to show is just the basics of heat recovery ventilators. And I like to simplify it by saying this: it's 2 fans in a box. One that's exhausting air out there, you see them there to the right-hand side of the box. One that's exhausting air out of the building, one that's bringing air into the building, which means we have 2 separate air streams. They don't actually meet each other. They cross through that heat recovery core that improves the energy performance of these devices. But fundamentally, its key feature is it's bringing in outside air and it's taking out stale air. And some people say, well, why do we need these? We didn't used to need them. Well, we've always needed ventilation in houses. We've always needed it. And we used to get our ventilation by one of 2 ways. We used to either open windows, and in summer you may still be doing that, but in winter people would say, I don't want to open the windows. It's bringing in cold air. It might be bringing in dust from outside. So typically people are using windows less than they used to. And then second, we are more carefully building houses so that we don't have unwanted air leakage through electrical outlets or around windows. And so we just need to be understanding that all houses need the capacity for air in and air out. Now, it's okay if people say, I don't want to run it in the summer because my windows are open. That's totally fine. But in times where windows are closed for extended periods of time, then we would say the occupants need fresh air And that's what this device is doing. And the nice part is, unlike opening a window where you have to pay for 100% of the energy cost of heating up, these devices are roughly 70 to 80% efficient. That is, they recover 70 to 80% of the temperature difference between the inside air and the outside air. And that might be a little instructive just to do some simple math and say, for example, if it's 20 degrees Celsius inside and it's minus 20 degrees Celsius outside, that's a temperature difference of 40 degrees. So the air wants to come in at minus 20. As it comes across this device, it gets warmed up by 80%. 80% of 40 degrees, 32 degrees. So the air starts at minus 20, comes through the heat recovery core, gets warmed up by 32 degrees, which means it comes into the house at 12 degrees Celsius. And of course, that is cooler than 20 degrees Celsius air. I have to heat it up a little bit, but it's way warmer than minus 20 degrees Celsius air. So I can get fresh air that the family needs, good fresh air for our lungs, for our health, to remove moisture without having to pay the majority of the energy cost. And people often ask me, so how much do they cost to run? Now, depending on where you're located, your community is, depending on how electricity is generated and the cost of electricity in various communities, typically the cost to run those two fans, if I left it running 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, the cost to run the fans is in the order of about $30 for new HRVs because they have better fans in them. Old HRVs, it might have been as much as $80 to $100 for the electrical cost to run the fans. So the newer devices, much more efficient, better motor technology, about $30 a year. Now there is a cost to heat up that extra that I mentioned. It got to 12 degrees Celsius. There is some cost to heating that. That's going to depend on how you're heating. If you're using wood or oil, electricity, natural gas in some communities. Typically, that's in the order of another $80 to $100 a year. That's about it. Claude, not so bad, right? To get fresh air in a home for roughly 20 or 30 cents a day. And again, if we're not running it in the summer, if windows are open, it's not a big deal. But Claude, you run an HRV in your house, have for a long time. Do you even notice the energy cost to run that device?
No, it's really insignificant in my opinion.
Right. And to know that your family's getting good fresh air and moisture control and so on. So just wanted to highlight that this is a pretty straightforward box. In terms of maintenance, you can start to think there's really only 2 or 3 moving parts. There's those 2 fans. We're going to show you what's called a damper, a defrost damper. But generally speaking, they're pretty simple devices when you open them up. And they're installed in a couple of different ways. Typically, these are balanced ventilation systems. That is, the amount of air coming in is the same as the amount of air going out. And that's actually what we want so that we don't backdraft appliances, create negative pressure in houses. And typically, these devices have a central control somewhere located in the main occupied areas, maybe a hallway, that allows occupants the ability to turn it off if they want it, say in the summer if the windows are open, or to turn it to a low speed, normal operation, or sometimes you want it at high speed. Maybe it's extra cooking orders, or you've had an event, let's say a Thanksgiving gathering or something, and lots of people, you might say, oh, I want to turn it to a high speed to get a higher rate of ventilation. And you may still have some what we call point exhaust systems like a range hood, still valuable if you're cooking to vent those cooking odors directly outside. Sometimes we might still have a bathroom fan somewhere in the house to get rid of excess moisture, but typically balanced ventilation, air in equals air out. And the most common installations of these, typically you'll see the HRV, their unit at the bottom. You'll see the fresh air coming in, and typically in houses that have forced air heating systems, furnaces, for example, often the fresh air, the blue line, will be brought in through the HRV and delivered into the return air system of the furnace to allow it to be distributed throughout the house. These are called exhaust ducted systems or partially ducted systems. You notice the red lines, the red ducts, are pulling air from wet areas, kitchens, bathrooms, those kinds of areas, and pulling that air back, the stale, moist air, and shooting it back to the outside, recovering the energy from it. So that's a very common type of installation if you have forced air heating. Something to look for would be to look for those 2 vents in the bathrooms, bathroom and kitchen, typically high in the wall, sometimes on the ceiling, that are exhausting air back to the HRV and sending it to the outside. The second type of installation is for when you don't have a central forced air system. Let's say it's electric baseboard. Sometimes houses, wood-heated house, wood stove houses. In this case, the exhaust is still being pulled from the bathroom and the kitchen, but now you'll see the blue lines here, the blue ducts, that's delivering air directly, and ideally you would deliver it to bedrooms, main living areas. In fact, the codes would say at least 1 fresh air duct to each bedroom and at least 1 to a main living area. So here's a 2-bedroom house, which ends up with 3 ducts, 1 to each bedroom, 1 to the main living area. Fairly straightforward installation that we'd like to think about. So 2 typical installation types. And there's a unit installed in a house. You'll see it hung in this case in the basement off the floor joist system. You'll see those 4 ducts, one from the right-hand side, exhaust air being taken out of the building and sent to the outside. That's that insulated duct. On the left-hand side, you'll see that black insulated duct. That's bringing in air from outside. So 2 insulated ducts that we need to think about, 1 bringing air in, 1 taking air out, and then the ductwork, the exhaust from the bathrooms and the kitchen, and the fresh air either to the furnace return or to the each individual bedroom. So that's a fairly typical installation. And what we would say is just to remind yourself and community members, occupants, that these devices are fundamentally intended to provide whole house fresh air. And I often ask the question, when would people ask me, when would you like it to operate, or when should I turn it on? And I would say pretty much whenever the building's occupied. This is the fresh air for the occupants. This is to make sure that children and elders are receiving good quality air, that you and your family have a good night's sleep. So it's providing whole house fresh air on a continuous basis. And it's typically much quieter than simple exhaust fans, which is nice. So because we do want it to run on a low speed all the time, so typically it's much quieter. It does reduce cold drafts, and it solves moisture problems by default. When I take stale, moist air out and bring in cooler, drier air from outside, it dehumidifies houses in the wintertime. So if we have moisture problems, condensation problems on windows, this device solves it. In fact, it solves it better than a dehumidifier. Sometimes people like to run a dehumidifier. Well, dehumidifiers are great for the summer, but in the winter, you really want the HRV to be operating to solve moisture problems. The other nice part is it filters the incoming air, and we sometimes think about wood smoke and other pollens and dust from outside. Well, inside this device, there are filters, and you can put better quality filters for specific applications to filter that air as it's coming into the house. And then, as I mentioned, it saves energy. It recovers roughly 80% of the temperature difference between the airstreams. So that's kind of useful. And we, as I say, we do want balanced airflow. That's the other nice advantages of an HRV. The 2 fans, air in equals air out, means the house is in balance, means wood stoves don't backdraft. Pretty powerful, pretty important to ensure that we have air in equals air out, especially if we're doing any wood heating or combustion, even natural gas or oil-fired furnaces typically need or want that balanced approach, and it ends up being more efficient because we're recovering 80% of the temperature difference between those airstreams. And HRVs work better at reducing cold air into houses, so it's a more comfortable way to ventilate houses. So there you have it. Now, as we get started on the maintenance, we want to think about the first important caution. We would say always unplug the HRV before starting any cleaning or maintenance. And I'm showing on the bottom right, the outside air intake. You are going to inspect it, but the first thing you would do if you're going to maintain the HRV or service it would be to unplug it. Obviously, that's for safety reasons, but it's also to avoid drawing dust and debris into the ductwork while you're working on the unit. So always unplug before you start. And it's not just about turning it off, because sometimes there's still active elements, electrical elements within the unit. So it's not, you should turn it off at the control, but then the unit should be unplugged. And 99% of HRVs are in fact electrical plugs. So you don't have to do a disconnect. You simply unplug the unit, and you'll find that the cord on an HRV is, you know, less than 6 feet long to facilitate that. Simply unplug it. And then of course, I always refer to manufacturer's instructions and recommendations as how to best clean. What we're going to show you here is pretty generic cleaning, but again, this will be good for at least 95% of the HRVs that are going to be in your communities are going to look very similar to this. There's about 5 different manufacturers, 4 in Canada alone, all doing really good stuff, and their equipment all looks remarkably familiar or similar, if you will, in terms of moving parts, different colors, different sizes, different types of fans, but the basic configuration you're going to find is all very, very similar. I'd be shocked if you didn't find, if you found too many devices that didn't look like the ones we're going to show you. And I am going to say there are some tools that you're going to need. You want to use those proper tools to avoid damaging or corroding parts. You don't need any harsh chemicals for this. So we'll just have you think about pretty simple tools that we want to get to. And I will say, be careful. There's lots of plastic parts, drain pans, and so on inside. And as most of you know, plastic can become brittle over time. So just be a little careful in how you're using tools and so on when you're in and around plastic parts. And then I'm going to give you a long list, and then we'll go through this list. So don't worry too much about it. And this presentation, Claude, we can make it available to folks after the fact. So you'd have this, and all of this information is available from publications from CMHC and many of the housing authorities. But here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to inspect and clean exterior hoods. We're going to clean filters, drain pans, fans, and cores inside the unit. We're going to clean interior grills in the bathroom, the kitchen, and even the supply grills in the bedrooms. We're going to think about plugging the unit in after we've done the cleaning and checking all the operating modes to make sure they're all working correctly. We're going to inspect and check operation of the motors and the fans within the unit. We're going to do a quick check of the ductwork itself to make sure it's properly installed and not causing issues. And so that includes inspecting and sealing off any accessible duct joints. Sometimes we might be measuring and balancing airflows. That's just a little bit of an aside. We won't do too much on that but because that's more of a longer course that would say, if you're having problems with a unit, what would I do? If the unit seems to be working correctly, no need to measure and balance airflows at that part. If there were any defective items upon your inspection and maintenance, maybe replacing filters, of course you would do that as time went by. And then there's always a little reinforcement, right, of ensuring the occupants about ongoing good cleaning methods, because you can't be there if you're from the housing authority. You can't necessarily be there often enough. So we'd like to educate occupants where they're capable. Obviously, we don't want to think about elders doing this, but generally speaking, most families can do some of this maintenance on their own. So we'll try to highlight those elements. So there we have it. In terms of what you're going to need, it's pretty simple, basic stuff. You probably do want a little portable vacuum cleaner to clean out inside the unit, to clean filters. Mild soap and water, no need for any harsh chemicals. Well, maybe a little bit of bleach just to clean drain lines, but in general, just mild soap and water. A good stiff brush for outside cleaning, a hose or bucket to clean the core, or perhaps in most residents, there's perhaps a laundry tub downstairs that you could use, but you probably want to be ready to take a hose or bucket to clean the core. But here's an odd one, an old toothbrush to clean fan blades on, not necessarily every year, but now and again, if they're really caked up, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. A little bit of water, and maybe it's in a bucket or in a jug to flush the drain lines. A little bit of tape, foil duct tape, in case there's tapes come loose on ductwork. So we'll want that in hand. And then if you were doing bigger maintenance, like a balancing or troubleshooting problems with flows, you would need a pressure gauge. I'm not going to spend too much time on that today, just so that you know there are tools if you needed to say diagnose problems with airflow in a house. Similarly, a balancing kit, typically not needed on an annual basis, only if there's problems with a unit. So those are the kinds of tools you need. And of course, maybe some common hand tools. Some HRVs, they have door latches. You don't need a tool. Some HRVs, you do need a common screwdriver, typically a Robertson or Phillips screwdriver is typically all you would need. Maybe a knife or something to, if there was something to cut. But generally speaking, pretty simple hand tools to get done. And let's think about getting started. And in terms of today's session, it's really about the cleaning of, a thorough cleaning of the filters, and we'll go through each one of these, the core, the drain pans, fan wheels in some cases, interior grills, the ones on the wall in the bathrooms or the kitchen, or the supply ducts in the bedrooms. We want to clean the outdoor hoods, and there may be some other maintenances that I kind of alluded to as where we had it. And Claude, at this point, I'll ask you, this sounds pretty basic to you. How often do you find yourself in your house cleaning your unit? Is it, how many times a year would you say?
I would say on minimum 2 and upwards of 4. So just I like to check on it periodically. Turn the unit off, open sort of the we'll call it the hood,
Yep.
the cover. Kind of take a look inside and see if it's not too bad. I'll I'll let it go for a
Yep.
little longer, but generally in the range of 2 to 4 times a year.
I love
And
that.
periodic, I just checking.
Yeah. And the ones that we really want to check is the outdoor hoods, but I love that 2 to 4 times a year. It depends on occupancy. If it's, for example, a household, maybe it's elderly folks and, not a lot of activities. You might say, well, they probably don't need it more than a couple times a year. But if you got a big family, lots of kids, lots of things happening, then it might be 3 to 4 times a year. I often say, a good time to remind ourselves of when to do it. We all know that we're supposed to change our filters in our furnace or check our smoke detectors twice a year, right? At the time change, when we go from daylight savings and back to normal, they'll say, check your smoke detectors. Well, that's a good time to say, hey, let's check in on the HRV. That gives us 2 times a year. And then I'll often say to folks, maybe over the Christmas holidays, you're waiting, you maybe don't have much to do between Christmas and New Year's, you're having a few family parties. Well, let's spend a little time doing it there. So I like 3 times a year. I think is a good number, but I don't mind that idea of 2 to 4. And these are the elements on our list. And we're talking about maybe half an hour of work in most cases. So not too bad. So let's start with, we've turned the unit off. Remember, turn the unit off, and you're going outside and understanding that the fresh air intake, typically near the ground, about 18 inches above the ground, it gets full of grass clippings and pollens and dusts and so on, depending on the season, maybe leaves in the fall. So we want to look outside, and it's a little bit inconvenient. You have to look down. You want the unit turned off because when you go to brush this off, you don't want that debris being sucked back into the unit. So a stiff brush or a rag, just wipe it down. Just make sure it's the screen. And of course, that screen is to keep out rodents and birds and so on. And so you'd want to check to make sure the screen is intact. It's not keeping out. Some people think, well, I'll put a fly screen on there, a very fine mesh like a screening. The problem with that is they're too restrictive and they need very, very regular maintenance. So you'd have to check those once a month. These screens, typically, these 1/4-inch mesh screens, you're talking about once every 3 months, 3 to 4 months, and particular seasons, right? In the fall, remember I mentioned the smoke detector right around this time of year. Boy, you might expect there to be leaves. In the spring, it might be pollen and so on. That's caked it up. The dandelion seeds and so on that might be clogging this up. So 3 times a year. This is the fresh air for your home. And if you'd also look and see if the hood is intact, make sure you caulk it and so on. But actually, this ends up being one of the most important things to do. Claude, something you can do more often, right? If you're outside and maybe doing the fall maintenance or doing some spring cleanup, always good to look under the hood in this case, and make sure that it's clean. So that's pretty useful. And then there are different styles of hood. I'll just remind you, the one on the top left is probably the best of the hoods. That nice rounded hood with lots of availability for air. Still has a screen on it, so you got to check that screen. The bottom left, these are very common hoods, the one at the bottom left, but they're very restrictive on airflow, and they're actually harder to clean. So in new buildings, you'd want to use a hood like the one on the left. If there are top left, if in older units that are installed, they're using the hoods that you see the little louvers at the bottom left, you'd want to make sure those are regularly checked, and you probably need the toothbrush to clean those out. On the bottom right, you'll see there is capability. Sometimes you go, I only see one hood. Well, it might be what we call a tandem hood or a combined hood. And 2 or 3 of the manufacturers have these. They work really well. And what they're doing is they're concentric. Air's brought in the bottom of the hood. The exhaust air is expelled out through the front. And again, they just need to be checked. So on some houses, you might find only one hood instead of 2. And then in the middle, I'm suggesting just check if, in fact, the hoods are still thoroughly sealed, thoroughly caulked. And every now and again, every 7 to 10 years, you might have to recaulk the hood. So that's the first thing to think about. You're using a stiff brush, maybe a rag. Don't really need to wash them or anything. Just brush them off to make sure they're clean and clear. So that's number one. And just a reminder of where those hoods typically are. If you're outside, you're looking. Sometimes they get, as trees or bushes build up, you don't see them. Typically, the hoods are installed about 6 feet apart. They have to be a minimum 3 feet apart, unless you're using one of those concentric hoods. Typically, they need to be above snow levels. So typically 18 inches at least above grade. Some communities, it might need to be more than that, depending on where you are in the snow areas. So this is typically where they're at. And if they're too low to the ground, there should be looked to see if there's a way to change that. You don't want them too low to the ground because they tend to then pick up more dust and dirt and so on. So just that's the outside hoods. And then next, I'll just put these up. We're going to clean the filters, the drain pans, and the core. So first, we're going to unplug the unit. Just remind you, it's probably already unplugged, should be, but I just want to reiterate that. And be a little careful, as I mentioned, not to break plastic components. And here you're using typically a vacuum cleaner, some damp rags, mild detergents, nothing fancy here. You're going to visually inspect the core. If it isn't too dirty, just vacuum it. And you kind of said that, Claude, that you don't always clean it. How often would you say you actually pull that core out and wash it out?
I would say at most maybe twice a year.
Yeah, and I'm going to say I do mine every other year. Maybe it's because I'm
Oh,
it's
wow.
just my wife and I at this point. This is the core itself, right? And it's only, I would say, once a year, every other year that it gets dirty enough that I need to worry. But depending on where you're located, again, how busy the household is and so on, maybe it's a little more than that. But typically think about once a year to pull that core out, maybe vacuum it, maybe wash it. Now, do check with the manufacturer's recommendations. And almost all manufacturers, right on the face of that core, there'll be an instruction sheet and it'll tell you what to do and not to do. Some manufacturers will say, don't wash the core, just vacuum it. Others would say, wash it out. They will always tell you, no pressure washer. I don't want a pressure wash. It's really just taking a garden hose or in a laundry tub, just running some water through it over the face of the core, just kind of shuffle the water across and just wash it out. And then just give it a good shake to get as much water out as you can. Doesn't need to be totally dry before you put it back in, but you'd like the most of the water shaken out of that device. And as I said here, remove either vacuum or flush it out with a hose. So that's the core itself, and they typically slide out and they get a little sticky. It might take a little bit of persuasion just to get your hands in, but be careful not to delaminate the core. Just be, hands on it, not fingers grappling at it, but hands on it and pulling thoroughly. Sometimes you need a little silicone spray when you go to put it back in to make sure the tracks are lining up. But typically, and these weigh in typically no more than 15 or 20 pounds. They're not that heavy, but if you drop them, they're pretty rugged unless you're dropping them. Some are made out of aluminum, some are made out of plastics. Both of those are subject to If you drop them, they're going to get dented or damaged. So you just need to be a little careful around that. So that's the first thing to think about. More commonly or more often, it's the filters. And you'll notice the two filters there kind of on the diagonal. And as I say, 90% of HRVs look like this. Sometimes the filters are on the top of the core, sometimes on the bottom of the core, but fundamentally two filters. And you're pulling those out and you're vacuuming them, sorry. And if they're really dirty, and depending on the type, you might wash those as well. Some are washable, some aren't. These do need to be replaced, I would say, every 3 to 5 years. So check with the manufacturer, order them up. Wholesalers now have them available. Many manufacturers will just sell them online as sets. You order a set and those filters go in. And then you're going to damp wipe the drain pans where the condensate water has been dripping, just damp wiping out that device. And so as I say, you're vacuuming or washing the filters. You don't use any corrosive or strong cleaners. They don't need it. But the filters, as I say, I normally find every 5 years or so, you vacuum them 3 times a year for 5 years. They're getting pretty ragged. So as a community, you might want to think about ordering up filters for the units that you have and put them on a maintenance scheme of every 3 to 5 years. And there's a little example. There's the before on the left. You'll notice all the bugs and so on coming from outside. And that is normal, by the way. Remember, we put on a bird screen. We didn't put on an insect screen. So in fact, there will be some insects inside the box. They're always in the fresh air airstream. I normally have the vacuum at hand and handy as I open up the unit. If there are any bugs flying out, I try to capture those right off the bat. But there's the top left. That's where most of the cleaning gets done. And there you see on the bottom right, you're seeing the unit cleaned up. The filters have been vacuumed, the core has been washed out, damp wiped the entire unit, just getting bugs off. And that's kind of what we would like. It's not going to look perfect because it's obviously been there for years. This unit's about, this unit is, when this picture was taken, was 15 years old. So even after 15 years, it looks pretty darn good. So just vacuuming, damp wipe is what we're looking for. There are drains coming off the bottom of HRVs. This is the condensate that's in the wintertime when it's cold outside. There's going to be condensate that's dripping down. And that condensate only runs in the winter. Sometimes, depending on the unit, you might not see much condensation at all, but often there is, and there's been bugs in the unit and so on. So often these drains get plugged. So you want to flush out that drain line with water. So a little bucket of water, a little, let's say a jug of water, and sometimes a little bit of bleach, just if there's a little bit of mold and so on growing in there. So you would just flush that out. It's pretty straightforward. And make sure that drain line is properly trapped. It should have a trap line in it, a little loop to it, so that we don't have sewer gases coming back up into the unit. But just flush it out with water. It's nothing too serious. It doesn't have to be whisper clean. Just flush it out just to make sure it's draining correctly. And that sometimes you might need a little coat hanger or something to shove down just if it's gotten plugged with debris. So make sure they are properly drained. And then I'm showing here that we'd like you to inspect the fan wheels. Remember, there was 2 fans. That on the left-hand side, you're seeing what we call a centrifugal fan, or sometimes they call it a squirrel cage fan. And you'll notice the one on the right, it's gotten kind of caked up, right, over time. This is not common. It's not always the case, but a unit that's maybe hasn't been maintained in 10 or 15 years, or maybe the filters weren't properly done. So you would just take a toothbrush to that. Typically, this can be done with the fan still installed. Again, unplug the unit, of course, and just be a little careful. Again, it doesn't need to be whisper clean. Just vacuum that out. Sometimes you might use a little can of compressed air just to blow that out, and just damp wipe them. And when you turn on the fan, that dust and so on will get expelled either into the unit or back out the unit. So this isn't done all the time. It's just something to inspect and look at to make sure that they're clean. And then most HRVs have a defrost damper. So let's go through that quickly, what that's about. Remember, I said cold air coming in, warm, moist air going out. Within the core, that warm, moist air gets colder and colder. And as it gets colder, condensate actually happens in the exhaust side, of the HRV core. And in cold weather, below about -5 Celsius, that condensate will freeze. So whenever it's colder than -5, we need a defrost. And what a defrost does, this little damper mechanism, is it temporarily closes off the outside air, and recirculates warm air through the fresh air side of the core. So it defrosts the core from the fresh air side. This is very common. 90% of HRVs sold, maybe 85, have this kind of damper defrost. It's not in defrost all the time. It's typically in defrost for 5 to 10 minutes out of each hour. The colder it gets, the more we need for defrost. So in cold weather, it closes off for a short period of time to recirculate. Most manufacturers will show you how to put the unit into manual defrost, just so you can see that it's operating correctly. But you do want to make sure the damper opens and closes and seals properly. Now, you need to be careful. I don't want you to manipulate this by hand, or if you do, very slowly. You don't want to force this damper. Some dampers you can move manually, some dampers you can't. So don't overplay that. What you'd really want to do is turn the unit back on once it's clean and watch to see if it's working correctly. But you'll notice the components on the top of that picture. There's a damper motor, the bottom picture there, the damper motor, that's what's driving the damper open and closed. Then there's the damper itself. You see that blade, it's sort of a round disc below. Each one of these look a little different. Every manufacturer has a slightly different configuration, but the essence of it is there's dampers that close off the fresh air periodically during the winter season. There will be a temperature sensor, not typically something that you can fix. The damper motor, something you can fix. Typically never need to change the damper blade, but sometimes the temperature sensor will go, and that's typically a service item. And how would you know? Well, I'll show you in a second as to how you would know that that is true. And the timer control is typically back in the control box based in electronics. Nothing you can do to service that. You'll notice just off to the right, sort of top right of the picture, there's a little plug there, white plug. That's to unplug the damper motor for service or maintenance. So just something to think about. It is maintainable. So just want to make sure that's all working correctly. And then, so that's the unit itself. We've cleaned it up nicely. Now we want to look at the exhaust grills in the bathrooms. And typically they do get dusty because of skin flakes, dander, and so on. So we're just going to use a vacuum or a damp cloth. Obviously, you don't want to damage the paint finish around the grills, but it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes at bottom left, they're a louvered grill. More commonly, they're a round grill. And you would just unscrew that a little bit, clean it off, wipe it down, and you're good to go. And so check the exhaust in the bathrooms and kitchens, and also any supplies in the bedrooms or living areas. Pretty simple job. Might need a little step stool to get up because typically they're high wall. So sometimes you need a little step stool to get up. In the kitchen, sometimes there's a filter in that grill, that one on the bottom left picture. There might be a filter in behind that. And typically it's got a little louvered door that you can open up and clean the grease filters. So in kitchens, there's often a little wire mesh grease filter that would also have to be cleaned and or replaced. So think about that. And so now we've got the unit clean. We've cleaned the outside grills, we've cleaned the inside, we've cleaned the unit itself. Now we're into thinking about plugging the unit back in and just making sure everything's working correctly. Many units, the unit won't run unless the door is closed. They have a door interlock. So just keep that in mind, that you can't be checking, you plugged it in, it's still not working. There might be a door interlock. That's for safety reasons. But what you want to do is check that the fans run at different speeds. So you're going to do the control at low speed, high speed, make sure you hear the fans moving at different speeds. Listen for those fan speed changes. And each manufacturer has their own controls down there at the bottom. Usually they're not compatible with other units. I know that's kind of weird, right? Thermostat you can use on anybody's furnace. The HRV manufacturers still each have their own controls, and they're not compatible. So if it's a Venmar unit, you need a Venmar control. If it's a life breath unit, you need a life breath control. And so just keep that in mind. You can't mix and match the controls. So you're checking all the controls. And then because you're there, assuming you're doing the maintenance, say the community office is doing the maintenance, it is a good time to check the insulated, specifically the insulated ducts. You may recall there's two insulated ducts. The fresh air from outside is cold, so I need to insulate that duct. The exhaust air has come through the heat recovery core, so that exhaust air is also cold, so it needs to be insulated. And what you want to make sure is that insulation, specifically the outer jacket, in this case the black plastic jacket, hasn't been ripped or torn. Let's say they were doing some work in the basement and somebody happened to damage the duct. If there is water in the duct, if you feel the duct and it's wet inside the duct, inside that liner, that means there's a hole in the liner. So you don't want any tears or rips or holes in that black liner, because that'll cause condensation in the duct. So both ducts, both the fresh air and the exhaust air, have to be insulated, but you want to make sure they're properly sealed. And if you are finding the duct is dripping, that's because there's rips or holes or tears in the black liner. Typically, that means the duct has to be replaced. It's actually difficult to dry it out, which means I need to put a new piece of flex duct from the outside to the back to the unit. You might say, could I just splice that wet spot? The problem is we don't exactly know where the rips or tears are. So typically you have to change the whole duct. But that's unusual in an existing building that's been working fine, unless there's been some changes in the basement that may have caused a problem. So, but it's something to check on, if you will. And then it is a good time to inspect and make sure all the other duct joints, the ones coming from the bathrooms and so on, are sealed correctly. So we want to keep that in mind. So we tape or seal those joints if they haven't been already, using that foil duct tape. And then in some cases, if there's been issues, they're not getting proper airflow, you check the outside hoods, there's no airflow, or if the unit's freezing up all the time, it may be imbalanced. You remember we said we want the same amount of air coming in as going out. Well, there's a way to measure that. And the historic way of measuring that, there was what are called balancing kits, and maybe many communities already have these. It's a simple little kit. It has a gauge in it. It has a couple of these. You're seeing in the middle what's called a flow grid, and they can be inserted into the line. So that 6-inch round flow grid over on the left, you just pull off that flex, insert that grid, and use a pressure gauge to take a measurement. It comes as a kit, and the kits are in the order of a couple $100, maybe $300. And I would say a community, if you're looking after the maintenance of units, then you'd probably want a balancing kit on hand for the community. Not everybody needs this. Not every unit needs it. It's for new construction, new projects, and it's to troubleshoot problems with units out in the field. You've checked the fans, they're operating, but there's no airflow. It may be a balancing issue. Seldom does this have to be done on a regular basis, only if you're challenging, looking for problems inside that unit. And of course, you always follow the manufacturer's procedures. Different manufacturers have different devices. This balancing kit that you see here, this grid, could be used on anybody's unit, but sometimes manufacturers have other elements that you can use. And I mentioned if you have poor balancing, the signs of that is you'll feel excessive cold air coming from outside. You're not getting proper energy recovery. Or if you see frost on the fresh air pipe that's running from the HRV to the furnace, the non-insulated piece, that would be an indication of poor balancing, where I need to check on that. Or if you had constant frozen door locks on the house, that means the house is under positive pressure and the warm, moist air is going out through the door locks and freezing. That's a good sign that your HRV is not properly balanced. Or if you get high bill complaints, that I said it should only cost in the order of $100 to $150 a year, both the electrical cost and the heating cost. But if they all of a sudden see extraordinarily much higher bills than they're used to, that could mean that the unit's out of balance. Something's happened within the unit, dampers have moved or something, and the unit's not correctly balanced. Or if you're getting constant backdrafting or consistent backdrafting of chimneys, that could mean the unit's not balanced correctly. Or again, if you don't get proper moisture control, the unit's worked fine for years, now all of a sudden they have condensation problems on their windows. I wonder if the HRV is not working correctly. And sometimes HRVs, if the defrost isn't working correctly or balancing correctly, it'll actually turn itself off. So these are all signs that the unit is something's wrong, and it could be a balancing issue. Could be a balancing issue. It might be a control issue or something, but it could be a balancing issue. And so here is the procedure. You have this flow measuring station, as I mentioned. You install one in the exhaust airstream, one in the supply airstream, and you take a measure with a gauge that shows that the airflow is the same in both locations. And if it's not the same, then there's typically balancing dampers. You'll notice built into the collars of the unit, that F and G down at the bottom. Those are balancing dampers built into the collars of the unit. Sometimes it's a damper in the duct itself, sometimes on the unit, and you would simply balance it to within about 10%. So if it's 100 CFM of exhaust, we'd want 90 to 110 CFM of supply. That's about as accurate as you need to be. Don't need to be too worried about much worse than that. And then of interest, perhaps, is some manufacturers, many manufacturers now have these new balancing methods where and while I would always say that flow station's the most reliable, but there are manufacturers who have balancing tabs built into the unit itself. You'll see 4 little plugs on the door of the unit down at the bottom right there, and that's an indication. That's the place where I plug in the hoses from my gauge. You're seeing the 2 gauges there, and you can actually measure the flow right on the unit. Now, each unit comes with a little balancing calibration chart. So you have to look on the chart and figure out what the airflow is. So again, I don't want to go too deeply on this today, just kind of wanted to mention there are different methodologies that are used. And then as we start to finish up, any units or any items that need repair. And the most common one is worn out filters. I already said 3 to 5 years, you're changing filters. Defective damper motors are the next biggest thing to go. The dampers may be swinging loose, not moving correctly. You have to replace that damper motor or a broken damper. Third, the defrost temperature sensor not working correctly. And what you're going to find is the unit's worked fine for years, for the last 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden it turns cold, and I'm seeing the unit frosting up. That could be the temperature sensor not working. Again, check a manufacturer's instructions on how to diagnose that. After 15 years, my unit, it was 18 years, the motor seized up. Fan motors typically have a life of minimum 8 years, but maybe as much as 15 to 20 years. So you're going to have to change a fan motor from time to time. And typically they come as kits ordered from the manufacturer based on the model number, and swap them out. And typically it's plug and play, swap them out. Not that difficult to do. Sometimes defective control boards or relays, that's uncommon, because once they are working, control boards, once they're working, they tend to work for decades. So it's not typically a problem. But maybe broken drain fittings or blocked drain lines, that's something to look for. Fairly common. Maybe kids are playing in the basement or something, and the drain fitting gets knocked or broken. So we have to think about that. Or if you feel that insulated flex is wet, then you'd go, yes, that's a rip, tear, or hole in my device. And Claude, at this point, I'll ask you, you said you've had an HRV for decades now. Have you had to do any repair or maintenance on your unit?
Actually, no. Like I said earlier, I think the big thing is if you maintain it, certainly several times a year, I find there's really little wear and tear on the unit. It's a pretty simple, straightforward unit to maintain, at least in my opinion.
I would agree. In the old days, we used to have oilable motors. Now nobody uses oil. They're permanently oiled motors. Their new ECM fan motors last way longer. So thank you. I'm glad you did that. As I said, in my unit, I changed the filters after 5 or 6 years. But my first fan motor went after 18 years. The damper motor happened to go the next year. And then it ran again for another 10, 15 years. And then we made some other changes to the house and changed it out. But there you have it. And then I would say, lastly, let's show the occupants how and when to clean key components. And you had it right, Claude. It's 3 times a year. Clean the filters, clean the drain pans, check and clean the outside hoods. Once a year, clean the core. At most, maybe clean out the drain lines once a year. And then it's really up to the I would say, the community to think about major repairs. Obviously, that depends on your community and how those kinds of maintenance items are looked after. But typically, the occupants can do this. And again, we're going to know that certain members of the community, we're going to have do it for them. So I don't think we want elders outside getting on their hands and knees to check fresh air hoods. Let's find somebody else to do that for them. But otherwise, it's kind of 3 times a year: cleaning filters, cleaning drains, and clean the outside of it. That cleaning of the fans, the toothbrush and the fan, that's no more than once a year, and it's probably only 5 to 7 years. Typically, they just don't get dirty. So that's kind of where we like to be. And just we'll finish off just a bit of a summary. We're going to inspect and clean those exterior hoods. We're going to clean the filters, the drain pans, the fans, and the core. We're going to clean the interior grills. We're going to plug the unit back in. We're going to check all the operating modes of control. We're going to inspect and check operation of the defrost dampers and fans. We're going to check that insulated duct for moisture and pour taping to make sure there's no moisture in the duct. We're going to just have a quick look at the ductwork to make sure all accessible joints are taped. If needed, we're going to measure and balance flows. If needed, we're going to repair and replace defective components. We're talking about 3 times a year, maybe 20 to 30 minutes to clean hoods, filters, cores, and then once a year, 3 times a year, the filters and the outside hoods, once a year, the core and the maybe the drain lines. So not too bad in terms of the maintenance. And I want to remind you, and everybody on this call, and I want you to remind your community members, this is fresh air. Whenever they want fresh air in their home. People say, why do I run this? When would you like fresh air in your home? Well, all the time. Exactly. That's why this runs. It's not because we made houses tight. It's not, if they don't want to live with fresh air, then go ahead, turn the unit off. But now they need to recognize that the windows are going to condense. They're not going to be healthy in their home. So whenever people are breathing in a house, these devices should be running. And if they want to be running that length of time, then we need to maintain them, cleaning the filters, cleaning the core. Every 3 times a year is what we're looking for. And so just to educate them on that idea that this is fresh air for their family, the health of your lungs. We'd like to talk about this as being the lungs of the house, helping people with that, and remind you again of the tools. Nothing fancy: vacuum cleaner, mild soap and water, stiff brush, hose or bucket, an old toothbrush, a little bit of water to flush the drain lines, maybe some foil duct tape. These are all the other elements that maybe the community has available. So not much in terms of materials that you need to do this work. This is recently published. This is CMHC created a nice little, just a little sign, I guess, that you could hand to occupants, and it shows you from the sort of top left there, step 1, unplug the unit, pull out the filters, check the outdoor hoods, inspect the lines for the drain lines, pulling out the core, vacuuming it, sometimes washing it, cleaning the interior grills, plugging the unit back in. Not so bad, right? A nice little piece. And then there's a maintenance checklist. These are available from CMHC, and you could hand one to each community member and say, here's a little checklist, something for you to do every 3 months or so. And I would just say, for more information, you can go to CMHC, but I'll just say thanks, Claude, for having me on, and hopefully this is of some value. I don't know if you had any questions that you wanted to ask that you think are common.
Yeah, Gord, if you don't mind, maybe a couple more minutes. Like you indicated, I have a HRV in my house. Certainly, it makes life in the air quality in the house, I believe, a lot better. One of the big issues, and I'm glad that you're talking about the issue of maintenance on these, because on one occasion I was in a house and doing an inspection, and I opened up the cover to the HRV, only to find it sort of the bees have started now to occupy this box.
Mm.
So of course the question is, you ask the homeowner and you just say, have you ever cleaned or done any maintenance on? No, I just thought it works permanently. And I think that's part of the maybe misconception is there's no maintenance required on this type of unit. And certainly you've really brought to light all the issues and certainly a really good guide on maintaining and the purpose of maintaining these units. So that's just a point of observation. But again, you and I live in an area, southwestern Ontario, where we often experience high humid temperatures and certainly a lot of humidity. Is there any concern about that on the HRV unit itself?
It's a good question. The humidity outside in the summertime is what we're speaking of typically, right?
Yes.
Outside in the wintertime is cold and dry in all climates. So the unit acts as a good dehumidifier in the wintertime. In the summer, it is bringing in the warm, humid air, whatever is outside, warm, humid air. And I'm bringing that in. If you're finding that too humid, and if there are communities that are doing air conditioning, so running an air conditioner to cool the house and dehumidify the house, there's a technology called ERV, Energy Recovery Ventilator. And rather than putting in an HRV, it's going to look remarkably similar. The core is just going to be made out of a different material. They're typically not swappable. Some manufacturers you can swap the cores, but in most cases you have to buy it as an ERV. And so in a community where there's air conditioning being done, if your occupants, your household are using air conditioners, significant amounts of air conditioning, then you would switch to ERV. Generally speaking, in your communities, we would say it's HRV that you're thinking about. But in southwestern Ontario, or let's say southern Ontario, where there's significant amounts of air conditioning loads, then an ERV is a better choice. The maintenance is almost identical, except you can't wash ERV cores, you just vacuum them, but still the filters to clean and so on. So ERV, Energy Recovery Ventilator, the core has the ability to remove moisture. As much as it's exchanging heat, it's also exchanging moisture. So that can be pretty powerful, pretty useful. So that might answer that question. And just going back to your other question, in terms of maintenance, encourage folks to understand it's fresh filtered air. Actually say that to them, fresh filtered air. That means it's filtering the air, and filters need maintenance. That's why it's the HRV doesn't need the maintenance. It's the filters that need the maintenance.
Great presentation. And I personally thank you. So does the other John.
Yes,
the real John Kidrowski.
John. Yes.
Anyways, he wasn't able to attend with us this morning, but certainly very much appreciated and very informative. And I think a lot of people that are involved that certainly need to take a look at an HRV, and as you mentioned, possibly even an ERV, need to really think about the maintenance of these issues. So certainly greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Claude.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you again.
Okay. Bye for now.